The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches like skeletal fingers scratching at the window pane. Lucia Reyes sat in the back seat of the old car, her hands gripping the cold leather of the seat. Outside, the town of Silverbrook was fading into the dusk, its silhouette against the dying light of the day. It looked almost abandoned now, its buildings in desperate need of repair, their windows darkened by years of neglect. Silverbrook was a place that had always existed in the back of Lucia's mind, a place she had long avoided, a place filled with ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. She hadn't been back since she left with her mother all those years ago, running from the darkness that seemed to hang over her family like a curse. Her mother had always told her to forget about it, about the house, about the town, about everything that had happened. But now, with her mother's sudden death, Lucia was forced to return. It was a cold, wet evening when the phone call came, a stranger's voice on the other end, telling her that her mother had passed away in her sleep. The last few years had been spent in silence between them. No contact, no communication. But now, Lucia was here, making her way back to the place she had been taught to forget. The car pulled up in front of the old house, the house that had once been home, but now felt like a prison. Silverbrook Manor, the Reyes family estate, the house that had been in her family for generations, the house that had seen more death and sorrow than any place should ever endure. Lucia stared up at it, her heart pounding. It was larger than she remembered, looming in the fading light like a sentient being, watching her, waiting for her to step inside. The windows seemed dark, hollow, as though the house itself had no soul left to reflect. Its dark stone walls, now covered in ivy and mildew, seemed like they were slowly crumbling, worn down by time and a heavy weight of secrets buried beneath. Taking a deep breath, Lucia opened the car door and stepped out, her boots sinking into the wet earth as she made her way toward the front door. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker, as though the house was pulling her in, urging her to come closer. It was a feeling she had never quite been able to shake, even as a child. The house had always been alive, alive with its secrets, alive with its darkness. She hadn't wanted to come. She hadn't wanted to face what was inside this house, but now she had no choice. The door creaked open as Lucia pushed it, the sound echoing like a ghostly whisper through the empty halls. The smell of dust and stale air hit her immediately, mingling with the faint scent of something old, a smell she recognized as belonging to the house itself. The walls seemed to watch her, their cold, silent presence oppressive. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. The grand staircase rose before her, its dark with polish to a dull sheen, the banister worn down from years of use. It looked almost like it hadn't changed at all. The portraits on the walls were the same, her ancestors, all stoic and silent, staring down at her with eyes that seemed too alive for their time. Lucia's fingers brushed over banister as she ascended the stairs. It had always felt strange here, too many shadows, too many secrets. And now, with her mother gone, those secrets felt heavier than ever. She needed answers. She needed to understand what happened to her mother and to her family. At the top of the stairs, Lucia stopped in front of the door to her mother's old bedroom. Her heart skipped a beat. It felt wrong to be here. The door had always been off limits to her, a place her mother had kept locked, a place that held the answers to questions Lucia hadn't dared ask. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Was she ready to know what lay behind it? What had her mother kept hidden from her all these years? With a steadying breath, Lucia turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was as she remembered it, dark, dusty, and untouched. But as she stepped inside, something felt different. The air was colder here, almost frigid, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The bed was made, but the sheets were old, yellowing at the edges. The dresser, once a rich mahogany, now looked worn and weathered. But it was the vanity mirror that caught Lucia's attention. It stood in the corner of the room, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. As she approached it, the reflection that stared back at her was distorted, blurry, as though the mirror itself was reluctant to show her the truth. Lucia's fingers brushed against the glass, and immediately the air grew colder. A low hum filled her ears, distant but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing in time with her own heartbeat. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in her mind. "Leave." Lucia recoiled, her heart racing in her chest. She turned sharply, but there was no one there, only the emptiness of the room, the echo of the house's ancient voice lingering in the air. "Leave. Leave this place. It's not safe." The voice was cold, chilling, and familiar. It was the same voice that had whispered to her when she was a child, warning her of the house's dark power. It was a voice that haunted her dreams, her nightmares, for as long as she could remember. Her head spun, her thoughts racing. What was happening? Was the house trying to speak to her? Or was she losing her mind, like her mother before her? The darkness was closing in again, and Lucia could feel it, like a presence, a weight pressing down on her chest. It was as if the house itself was beckoning her, calling her to confront something buried deep within its walls. With trembling hands, Lucia reached for the drawers of the vanity. She needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. As she opened the first drawer, a pile of old papers and photographs spilled out. She sifted through them quickly, her fingers shaking as she searched for something, anything, that could explain the strange happenings in the house. At the bottom of the drawer, something caught her eye, a small leather-bound journal. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, the leather worn and cracked from years of neglect. Her mother's handwriting was unmistakable on the first page. Lucia felt a chill run down her spine as she opened it. May 12, 1982. I am writing this as a warning. The house is changing, and I can no longer ignore what is happening. I've kept it from Lucia for so long, but now I must tell her the truth. The curse is real. It's in our blood, in our bones, and it has haunted our family for generations. The house feeds on our pain, our grief, our secrets. It has been alive for centuries, and it will not stop until it has claimed us all. Lucia is the last of our line, and if she does not understand what is happening, the curse will consume her too. I fear that it is already too late. Lucia's hand trembled as she read the final words, her heart pounding in her chest. The journal fell from her hands, and the room seemed to grow darker. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The house had never been just a house. It had been a prison, a living, breathing entity that had trapped her family in its grasp for generations. Lucia couldn't escape now. She had already come too far. The truth was clear. The house was alive, and it had claimed her family. And now it was coming for her. Episode 2, The Silent Watcher. Lucia couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't the first time she felt it since stepping back into this house, but it was stronger now, more insistent. The oppressive atmosphere of Silverbrook Manor seemed to wrap around her like a suffocating blanket. Every corner, every shadow, filled with memories that were not her own. She stood in the center of her mother's room, still holding the old journal in her trembling hands. The words on the pages were etched into her mind, gnawing at her sanity. The house was more than just a house. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something hungry. Lucia snapped the journal closed, her fingers gripping the leather cover as though it might slip away from her. She felt the weight of it, the weight of everything, pressing down on her chest. The house had come alive in a way she hadn't anticipated, and now, with the journal's chilling revelations, she knew the truth was far worse than she could have ever imagined. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. The house feeds on our pain, our grief, our secrets. Lucia stepped back, her breath shallow. She had to get out of here. She had to leave. But something in her gut told her that running wasn't an option. The house had drawn her in, and it wasn't going to let her go. Downstairs, the air was thick, colder than it had been before. The shadows cast by the setting sun stretched long across the floor, and the light from the fireplace flickered uneasily, casting strange shapes on the walls. Lucia glanced around the room, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just beyond her line of sight. She was being paranoid. She had to be. The house's oppressive nature was affecting her mind, but as she turned to walk toward the kitchen, she froze. There, standing in the far corner of the room, was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, watching her with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Lucia's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Maya?" she called out, her voice cracking, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her. Lucia took another step back, her feet heavy on the floor. The figure in the corner began to melt into the shadows, its form dissipating like smoke in the air, but the eyes, they stayed, glowing, burning through the darkness. "Maya," Lucia whispered again, but the figure was gone. The room was empty once more. But the feeling of being watched, remained. Her mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and fear. Could it have been her imagination? Was the house playing tricks on her? It had to be. She hadn't seen anyone, just shadows, just memories. And yet, something in the pit of her stomach told her that whatever she had just seen was real. But before she could make sense of it, she heard a sound, a low creak, coming from somewhere above. Lucia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. She turned quickly, her pulse racing, and sprinted toward the staircase. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to leave the house, but her feet carried her toward the source of sound. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the house's grip, its pull, or maybe, just maybe, it was a truth calling to her. She reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and empty, except for one door, the attic. It was there, in that attic, where the house's secrets had been buried. But the attic door was closed. She hadn't opened it yet, but it had always felt wrong. There was something about it that unsettled her, like something ancient, something dark, was hidden behind it. Lucia hesitated for a moment, staring at the door as if it were calling to her. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side, but one thing was certain. The house had made sure she would never leave until she uncovered the truth. She pushed the door open with a soft creak, the sound seeming to echo in the silence. The attic was darker than the rest of the house, the shadows stretching long across the floor, the air thick with dust and the scent of forgotten memories. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the dim room, but all she saw were boxes and old furniture covered in white sheets. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air felt stagnant, like no one had been here in years. But then she heard it, a voice, soft, faint, but unmistakable. "Lucia." Lucia froze, her blood running cold. It was her name, whispered in the darkness. She turned quickly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The voice had come from behind her. She spun around, her hand shaking as she reached for the light switch, but as her fingers brushed against it, the light flickered on and off, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. She was alone, but the room didn't feel empty. It felt alive. And then, her eyes fell on something, a small wooden box, resting on a dusty table in the corner of the room. It was old, ancient even, and the name carved into the lid sent a shiver down her spine. Reyes. It was her family name, the name that had been passed down for generations. She didn't know why, but she couldn't resist. She moved toward the box, her fingers trembling as she reached out to open it. The moment her hands touched the lid, a rush of cold air flooded the room, making her heart race. Inside the box was a collection of old, yellowed papers. She carefully lifted them, one by one, her breath quickening as she sifted through the pages. Most of the documents were faded, but the words were clear enough. The curse of the Reyes family must be passed down. Only one will break the chains. The house must never be abandoned. It must always remain. The bloodline must be protected, even at the cost of a life. Her hand shook as she read the last sentence, her mind racing. What was this? What had her family been involved in? Before she could process it, the air grew heavy again, and the whisper returned, louder this time, closer. "Lucia?" She turned around, but the room was empty. A voice echoed in her mind. "The curse is not over. It is only just beginning." Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the horrifying truth. The house was not just a place. It was a living entity, and it was drawing her in. Lucia stumbled back, clutching the box to her chest, her eyes wild with fear. The air around her seemed to pulse, like the house was alive, watching, waiting for her to make her next move. She had to leave. The journal, the box, everything was starting to make sense in the worst possible way. The house wasn't just a place tied to the past. It was a force, a dark force that had claimed generations of her family. And now it was coming for her. Episode 3, The Unseen Hand. The house had never felt more alive. Lucia Reyes stood in the center of the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath her as she nervously scanned her surroundings. The shadows had grown longer, darker, and even the flickering of the candlelight seemed to carry a sense of foreboding. Every corner of Silverbrook Manor held its secrets, secrets that had remained hidden for generations. And the more Lucia uncovered, the more she realized that those secrets were not buried in the past. They were still alive, waiting for her to uncover them. As she made her way toward the old staircase, the weight of the house's history pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. The journal her mother had left behind still weighed heavily in her hands. She had barely begun to understand its meaning, but it was clear now that the house had a power of its own, a power that had been passed down from generation to generation, consuming those who lived here, and now it was coming for her. Lucia had always believed her mother's warnings were nothing more than the ramblings of a woman burdened by a fractured mind. But now, as she stood in the house her mother had so desperately tried to escape, she realized the truth. The house was alive. Its influence seeped into every brick, every beam, every shadow. And it was calling to her. She could feel it. The house was watching her. A strange sensation crept over Lucia as she ascended the stairs. It wasn't just the oppressive air or the eerie silence. It was a sensation that something was there, lurking just out of sight. The chill that had settled in the walls seemed to reach out to her, like a hand brushing the back of her neck. Her mother had been right. She shouldn't have come back. But now that she was here, there was no turning back. She had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. At the top of the stairs, Lucia hesitated. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors that led to rooms she had long forgotten. The door to her mother's bedroom was still ajar, the faint scent of lavender and dust lingering in the air. But it wasn't the room that called to her. It was the door at the far end of the hall. The attic, the room that had been locked for as long as she could remember. The room her mother had kept off limits, even when Lucia was a child. It had always been a place of mystery, a place she had been forbidden to enter. And now, it felt like the heart of the house, a place where the secrets of the Reyes family had been sealed away, waiting for someone to come looking. Lucia took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Her hand trembled as she reached the knob, the metal cold under her fingers. The house seemed to hold its breath as she slowly turned the handle. The door creaking open with a sound that echoed down the hallway. The attic was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, cracked window that allowed slivers of moonlight to spill across the dusty floor. The air was thick with the scent of age and neglect, and the floorboards groaned under Lucia's weight as she stepped inside. The room was filled with old furniture, boxes, and piles of forgotten memories. Things her mother had never thrown away. Things that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. But in the far corner of the room, under a faded sheet, something caught Lucia's eye. A large, ornate mirror. It was out of place here, its polished surface untouched by time, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns. There was something about it, something that made Lucia's heart race. She approached it cautiously, her reflection shimmering faintly in the glass. The room felt colder now, the air growing heavier with every step she took toward the mirror. As she reached out to touch the surface, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window, making her jump. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, someone standing behind her in the reflection. But when she turned around, the room was empty. Only the dust and the silence surrounded her. Her breath quickened, and a chill ran down her spine. She was not alone. Lucia backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. What was it? What had she seen in the glass? The house seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain, the shadows swirling in the corners of the room, creeping closer as if they were alive. The mirror, it wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal. She could feel it now. The presence in the room. Something ancient, something hungry. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't just the house's oppressive atmosphere. There was something here. Something she couldn't see but could feel. in the very marrow of her bones. Suddenly, the whisper returned. Lucia. Her heart stopped. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried with it an undeniable power. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a summons. And before she could react, the mirror began to change. The glass rippled, distorting, warping like water disturbed by an unseen force. Lucia reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the surface. And the moment her fingers brushed the glass, the room around her seemed to shift. The shadows lengthened, the air grew cold, and the reflection in the mirror began to change. It was no longer her own face staring back at her. Instead, it was a woman's face, her mother's face, but distorted, twisted in a grotesque smile. Her mother's eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, and the air around her seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy that filled the house. "And Mom," Lucia whispered, but the reflection only grinned, the smile stretching wider, colder. And then, the woman in the mirror spoke. "You should have left when you had the chance, Lucia. Now you are mine." The words echoed in the room, and Lucia staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The mirror rippled again, the surface going black for a split second before returning to its usual reflective state. The woman's face was gone, replaced by Lucia's own, pale, wide-eyed, filled with horror. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on her chest, as if the house itself were trying to crush her. She turned to run, but as she did, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the attic. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. "No!" Lucia gasped, her hand scrabbling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The mirror began to glow again, faintly at first, then brighter, pulsing with the same eerie light that had filled the room when she first touched it. And in the reflection, something moved, something behind her. Lucia turned slowly, her breath coming in short, panic gasps, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a man, tall, dark, with eyes that burned like fire. His face was obscured by shadows, but his presence was unmistakable. He was watching her, waiting. She didn't know how, but Lucia managed to break free. The door finally creaked open, and she rushed out of the attic, her legs weak with fear. She didn't look back as she ran down the stairs, her heart racing, the sound of the house, creaking, whispering, shifting, echoing in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, throwing it open and stepping out into the night air. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, as though it were waiting for her to return. Episode 4, Shadows of the Past. Lucia sat on the edge of her mother's old bed, the weight of the silence pressing down on her like a 1,000-ton stone. The house was unervingly still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her. She had barely slept since the incident in the attic. The image of the shadowy figure that had appeared behind her in the mirror haunted her. The cold grip of fear that had wrapped around her chest when the figure's burning eyes locked onto hers was still fresh in her mind. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. The house had seen her. It had watched her, and now it was calling her. The journal. The pages were still open on the small desk beside her. She had read through them again, over and over, but the words didn't make sense. They were incomplete, disjointed, full of cryptic warnings and dire predictions. She had hoped that something, anything, might offer her a clue as to how to break the curse. But all it did was lead her deeper into confusion. Her mother's warnings were becoming clearer, but they only raised more questions. May 20th, 1990. I fear that I am running out of time. The house knows what I am trying to do. It's aware. It is aware of all of us, and I don't think there's any way to escape it. The house is alive in ways I can't explain. It feeds off of our fear, our regrets, and our sins. It has lived through generations of the Reyes family, and it won't stop until it consumed every last soul bound to it. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. Lucia must be protected. She must never know the full truth of our family's past, or she will be lost to it, like the rest of us. Lucia's hands shook as she placed the journal back down, her mind racing with the implications of what her mother had written. The house wasn't just a place of torment. It was a living entity, and it had consumed the Reyes family for generations. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Her best friend, Sarah. "Are you okay?" Lucia hesitated before responding, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Sarah everything. How the house felt alive, how she was being haunted by the spirits of her ancestors. But she couldn't. No one would believe her, not even Sarah. "I'm fine, just tired. The house, it's just messing with my head." Her thumb hovered over the send button, but before she could send a message, the room grew unnervingly cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that Lucia could see her breath clouding in the air. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, twisting and curling like they were alive, reaching toward her. Suddenly, she heard it, a soft, raspy whisper coming from the hallway. "Lucia." She froze. It wasn't her mother's voice this time. It was different, unfamiliar. Lucia's pulse quickened. The whispers were getting louder now, but they were distant, as though they were coming from inside the walls themselves. "Lucia, come to us, we are waiting." The word sent a cold shiver down her spine. She felt the familiar tug, the pull of the house, the beckoning call that was drawing her toward the darkness. With a growing sense of dread, Lucia stepped out into the hallway, her feet light against the floorboards that creaked under her weight. She was no longer afraid to move through the house. The fear had become something different now, something familiar. The house had wrapped itself around her, and she could feel it, as if it were a part of her. The whispers grew louder the closer she got to the staircase. It was coming from below, from the basement. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and took a hesitant step toward the stairs. The house seemed to hum with energy, its walls vibrating with a low, ominous sound. As she reached the top of the stairs, the whispering stopped abruptly, but it didn't matter. The silence was worse, the calm before the storm. Lucia felt the pull again, stronger this time. Something was waiting for her below. Something, someone. She could feel it in her very soul. With a steadying breath, Lucia descended into the basement. The air grew thick with dust, and the stench of mold filled her nose. The house smelled of rot and decay, of something that had been buried too long, forgotten. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space, the sound unnaturally amplified in the silence. At the far end of the basement, a heavy door stood ajar. She had never seen it before. It had always been locked, but now it was open. She approached it cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate throughout the house, as though the entire structure was groaning in response. Beyond the door lay an underground room. It was small and dimly lit, filled with dust and cobwebs. But in the center of the room, illuminated by the faint light from the single bulb hanging overhead, was a large, ancient chest. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of presence. It was as if the room was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Lucia stepped into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the chest, she could feel the air grow heavier, thicker. Something ancient and malevolent pulsed from within it. With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside were more old books, their pages yellowed with age. But it wasn't the books that drew her attention. It was the object resting on top of them, a small, delicate box made of dark wood, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with energy. Lucia reached out and touched the box, her fingers brushing the cool surface. The moment her skin made contact, the room seemed to shift, as though the very walls of the basement were bending, warping around her. The floor beneath her feet cracked, and the walls began to close in, the darkness pressing against her from all sides. Lucia gasped for breath, her heart racing as the box in her hands seemed to glow with a faint light. And then, as if in response, the voice returned. The same voice from the mirror, the one that had warned her before. "You are mine, forever?" Lucia's breath caught in her throat. The walls around her began to shift, warping into faces. Faces she recognized. Her ancestors. They were watching her, their eyes hollow, their gazes filled with pain. "Come, join us." Lucia. She shook her head, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't let them take her. Not like this. She needed to break the cycle. She needed to break the curse. The pressure in the room grew unbearable. Lucia's vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled toward the chest, toward the box. It was as if the very air around her was charged with a dark, magnetic force, drawing her in, trapping her in the past. Join us. Become one with us. No. Lucia screamed, clutching the box to her chest as though it were the only thing holding her to reality. She fought against the force, pushing with all her strength, until finally, it stopped. The room snapped back to stillness. The shadows receded. The pressure lifted. Lucia collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her hands shaking as she held the box to her chest. She was alone again. But the house was still there, and it was watching. Episode 5, The Binding. The house was quiet again, but only on the surface. Lucia stood in the dim light of the hallway, staring at the old chest in her hands. The box, with its intricate carvings and mysterious energy, had come to life the moment she touched it. The shadows around her felt heavier now, the air more oppressive. The whispers, once faint and distant, now echoed in her mind, louder and more insistent. You are mine. The house is yours now. The words wrapped around her like a vice, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her pulse raced as she turned and stumbled toward the stairs. The oppressive presence of the house had grown unbearable, and she could feel it watching her, waiting. Her heart was pounding as she made her way back to her mother's room. The walls seemed to close in around her, and each step she took felt heavier than the last. Her fingers clenched tighter around the box. It felt alive, pulsing in her hands, as if something was stirring inside it. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. The house had never let go. It had waited for her to return, for her to unlock the secrets hidden within its walls. But Lucia had not expected to uncover this, a cursed legacy that bound her family to the house. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deep the darkness went, how tightly it had entwined itself in the very fabric of her being. Lucia stepped into her mother's room and locked the door behind her. She sank onto the bed, the box still clutched tightly in her hands. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were reaching for her. She set the box down on the nightstand and stared at it. The carvings on the surface shimmered faintly in the low light, and the air around it seemed to hum with an eerie, malevolent energy. The house had called her, but this box, this was something different. For a moment, Lucia hesitated. What if opening it meant giving in to the house's power? What if it meant surrendering herself to whatever malevolent force lurked inside it? But she couldn't stop now. The truth had already been uncovered. She had already seen too much. She had to know what was inside. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was a small piece of parchment, yellow with age, covered in writing she could barely read. Lucia held it up to the light, her breath catching in her throat as she read the first line. The bloodline must be bound, or the curse will be unbroken. A chill ran through her as she read the rest of the text. It was an incantation, an ancient binding spell, one that had been used to tether the Reyes family to the house. Her family had been cursed, bound to the house for generations. The box was a key that would either release the family from the curse or lock them in forever. But the price of breaking the curse was steep. The final sentence of the parchment sent a shiver through her. The one who breaks a chain must sacrifice their blood to free the souls bound within. The price is life. The price is death. Lucia's head spun. The words were clear, but their meaning was incomprehensible. What did it mean to sacrifice her blood? To sacrifice her life? The curse had taken so much from her already. Could it really take more? She closed her eyes, her mind racing. Her mother had known about this. She had hidden the box away, kept it locked up for years. But now that it had been opened, there was no turning back. Lucia's fingers brushed the edge of the box, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the power of the house pulling at her, tugging her toward the darkness that had consumed her family. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were urging her to act, to make a choice. Free us, sacrifice yourself, "Release us, Lucia." Suddenly, the room was cold, colder than it had ever been before. The shadows that had been creeping along the walls began to grow, thick and black, wrapping around the room like tendrils. The air seemed to vibrate with an ominous hum, and Lucia could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, as though someone was approaching. But no one was there. The house was alive. It was waking up. Lucia gasped and stumbled back as a dark shape appeared in the corner of the room. A figure, standing motionless, watching her. It was tall, shadowy, its features hidden by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed with an unnatural light, burning through the shadows. The figure moved toward her, its presence growing more oppressive with every step. Lucia's breath caught in her throat, and her body froze in place. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing her cheek, and she could feel the coldness of its touch seep into her skin, like ice spreading through her veins. "You've come so far, Lucia," the figure whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. "But you cannot escape what is meant to be." Lucia backed away, her legs weak, but the figure was relentless. It moved closer, its eyes burning with an ancient, unfathomable power. The binding must be complete. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the shadows creeping forward, enveloping her. The air was thick with darkness, suffocating her. Lucia could barely breathe, her heart racing as she stumbled backward. The box! She had to make a decision. She had to decide whether to break the curse or accept the inevitable. The figure loomed over her, its hand reaching for her once more. But this time, Lucia was ready. With trembling hands, she grabbed the box and held it before her. The figure's eyes widened, and for the first time, it faltered. "You don't have to do this," Lucia said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I will end this. I will break the chain." The house seemed to tremble in response, the ground beneath her feet shaking as though it were alive with rage. The figure's eyes flashed, its form shifting as it snarled in fury. "You cannot escape what has been written," it hissed. "You are bound to this place. Your blood is ours." Lucia's hand shook as she held the box, her mind racing. The decision was hers. The weight of her family's curse, the weight of her mother's curse, pressed down on her. She could feel it, the heavy burden of the house's power. But she could also feel something else, a spark of defiance, a strength she didn't know she had. "No," Lucia whispered. "This ends now." She opened the box wide, releasing the dark energy contained within. A violent rush of wind filled the room as the shadows writhed and screamed. The house seemed to roar, shaking with the force of the energy being unleashed. The figure howled in pain, its form dissolving into the swirling darkness as the house began to tremble. The walls cracked, the floor groaned, and the lights flickered wildly. The air was thick with energy, electric, dangerous, unstoppable. And then, in the midst of the chaos, there was silence. Lucia opened her eyes, the heavy darkness lifting, replaced by the warm glow of the house's old lamps flickering softly. The air was still, the shadows had receded. For the first time since she had arrived, the house felt quiet. She had broken the curse. But at what cost? Episode 6, The Price of Freedom. The silence was deafening. Lucia stood in the middle of the grand foyer, her breath shallow and her body frozen, as though the very air in Silverbrook Manor had thickened into something more oppressive than before. The house had been quiet for hours. Too quiet. The shadows that had once seemed so alive, so palpable, had receded, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that pressed in on her from every direction. The curse was supposed to be broken. The ritual had been completed. The box had been opened, the binding undone, and the malevolent figure had been vanquished. The house should have been free. Lucia should have been free. But as she stood there, surrounded by the creeping shadows, something in the pit of her stomach told her that it was far from over. The air was thick with tension, and yet the house seemed almost calm. Too calm. The usual creaks and groans of the ancient structure were absent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had once enveloped her felt distant now, almost as if it were waiting, biding its time. Lucia took a step forward, her boots echoing against the wooden floor, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the silence of the house. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Nothing. It was as if the house had exhaled and was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. She could feel it, though. The house was still here. It hadn't given up. It hadn't surrendered. She had broken the curse. Or so she thought. But was it really over? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away, but it gnawed at her. The darkness was far too comfortable here. It had always been here, nestled in the walls, in the corners, and the very bones of the house. And now it had changed. The air felt wrong, heavy with a new kind of presence, one that was more menacing than anything she'd encountered before. Lucia's eyes darted to the staircase. She had no plan. She didn't know what she was looking for, but instinct pushed her toward the upper floor. Something called to her, a voice she couldn't place, a pull at her chest that urged her to move. As she ascended the stairs, her steps slow, deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching her. Her hand tightened around the railing, and her gaze lingered on the door to her mother's room. The place that had once been filled with her mother's presence, her warnings, her love, now felt cold, empty. Lucia hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been in this room countless times as a child, but now it felt like a place that had never truly been hers. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob, and with a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was as it had always been. Dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight, the air stale. But there was something else now. A strange energy pulsed in the room, swirling around her like a tangible force. The air felt thick, as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lucia's gaze fell on the bed, where the box she had opened earlier was now resting on the pillow. The strange carvings on its surface glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an eerie glow across the room. She hadn't touched it since the ritual, but now, standing in the room, she felt compelled to approach it. Her footsteps were hesitant as she walked toward the bed, her pulse quickening. The closer she got to the box, the heavier the air felt. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, its presence suffocating. She reached for the box, her fingers trembling as she lifted it, and as soon as she touched it, the air around her seemed to shift. The room grew darker, the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching toward her like fingers. Lucia's heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't pull away. The box opened on its own. Inside was a single, folded letter, written in her mother's handwriting. Lucia's hand shook as she carefully unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but the ink was clear enough to read. The words, however, were not what she expected. Lucia, if you are reading this, then the curse is already in motion. I have failed. You must know that the house is not simply a house. It is alive. It is bound to our bloodline, to our very souls. I tried to break the curse, but I couldn't. I thought I had trapped it, but I only fed it. And now it will take what is rightfully its own. The bloodline cannot be freed without a price, Lucia. And the price is you. Lucia's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling from the words. She stumbled back from bed, her hands trembling, the letter falling from her fingers. "No," she whispered. "No, this can't be true." But the words were clear. Her mother had known. She had tried to protect her, to hide the truth, and now it was too late. The house had changed her mother. It had consumed her, just as it had consumed so many before her. And now, it was turning its gaze on Lucia. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing thicker, pressing in on her. The temperature dropped, and Lucia could see her breath misting in the air. The whispering returned, louder now, filling her mind with incoherent, maddening words. "You are the key. You are the sacrifice. The bloodline must be bound." Lucia's heart raced. She knew what she had to do. Her mother's letter had made it clear. The curse could not be broken, not without a price. And that price was her own life. But there had to be another way. There had to be a way to escape. The house seemed to shift again, the walls groaning as though they were waking up from a long slumber. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and a crack appeared in the ceiling, the sound echoing like thunder. The house was alive, and it was angry. Lucia turned to leave the room, but as she did, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more intense, until they seemed to crawl along the walls, toward her. The temperature plummeted even further, and Lucia's breath came in sharp gasps. She spun around, her hand reaching for the door, but the shadows were faster. They surrounded her, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. She could feel them, like tendrils, like hands pulling her in. The whispering grew louder, and now, it wasn't just in her mind. It was in the room, all around her. Join us. Become one with the house. The shadows lunged toward her, and Lucia cried out, struggling against their grip. The house was alive. It was pulling her in. She couldn't breathe. The shadows were suffocating her, and the room was spinning. She could feel herself being dragged into the darkness, the whispering becoming a deafening roar. Lucia, the voice was familiar, but it wasn't the voice she had heard before. It was softer, gentler. Lucia, you are not alone. Lucia's eyes snapped open, and for the first time, the shadows receded. The house itself seemed to quiet, the oppressive weight lifting. If only for a moment. She could feel the presence, her mother's presence, filling the room. The shadows faded, leaving her standing in the center of the room, gasping for breath. Episode 7, The Unraveling. The house was suffocating. Lucia stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her fingers gripping the railing as she looked down at the emptiness below. The house felt like it was closing around her, its walls bending inward, as if the very air were thick with malice. Each breath she took was heavy, labored, and the oppressive presence of the house weighed on her chest like a stone. She could still hear the whispers. They had never truly stopped, lingering in the back of her mind like a persistent echo, faint but ever-present. But now, the voices were clearer, more insistent. It's not over, Lucia. You cannot escape. The words swirled in her mind like a storm, their meaning shifting with every breath. The curse had been broken, or so she thought. But now, she understood there was no true escape. Not from the house, not from her bloodline, the box, the incantation, her mother's warning. The truth had unraveled in ways she couldn't have anticipated, each revelation more horrific than the last. She hadn't slept in days, not since that night in the attic, when the shadows had tried to claim her. Since then, every moment had been a blur, an unrelenting cycle of terror and confusion. The house twisting and changing around her, its grip tightening with every passing second. Her eyes flicked to the hallway behind her, where the door to her mother's old room still stood ajar. She had tried to leave it untouched, but it was impossible. The house refused to let her forget, to let her move on. The room was still dark, suffocating in its stillness, but she couldn't help but feel drawn to it. A sick sense of obligation gripped her as she moved toward the door, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the heavy silence. The walls seemed to pulse with energy as she entered, and the air grew colder. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way to the bed, where the box still lay, the same box she had opened weeks ago, the same box that had sealed her fate. Lucia reached for it, her hands trembling as she lifted it from the bed. She could feel it again, the pull, the sensation that the house was alive and that the box was a key to unlocking its final, most terrible truth. When she opened it, the box was different. The once delicate parchment inside had changed. The ink seemed to have darkened, as though it had been written in blood. The words, so familiar, now felt distorted, as if they were shifting beneath her gaze. The bloodline cannot be freed without sacrifice. The binding is eternal. The one who dares to break the chain will become the chain. There is no end, only the beginning. A chill ran down Lucia's spine as the words burned into her mind. The house wasn't just haunted. It was an ancient, living entity, its power tied directly to her bloodline. Her family had been the house's caretakers, its prisoners, its feeding ground. She had thought that breaking the curse would free her, but instead, she was bound to it forever. The house was not done with her. Lucia felt the weight of the truth settle heavily in her chest. Her mother had known. She had tried to warn her, but there was no escaping the bloodline, no escaping them. Before she could process the full weight of what she had read, a sudden noise echoed through the house. A door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the depths of the manor. Lucia's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside her door. Tap, tap, tap. Lucia slowly turned toward the door, her breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Then, just as quickly, the door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. The same shadow she had seen in the mirror, the one that had haunted her dreams and twisted her thoughts. It was a man, or at least, it had once been a man. His form was tall and thin, his face gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with a fiery intensity. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his features were sharp, angular. He seemed to flicker in and out of focus, as though his very presence were unstable, a distortion in reality. Lucia stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite herself. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its movement eerily graceful, like a dancer gliding across a stage. With each step, the shadows around him deepened, pulling the light from her room. The temperature plummeted, and Lucia could see her breath misting in the air. "You cannot run from what is yours." The figure finally spoke, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of stones grinding together. "You are bound to this place, just as your ancestors were, just as your blood demands." Lucia shook her head, her mind spinning with terror. I'm not like them." The figure's smile was slow, malicious. "Oh, but you are. You always have been." Suddenly, the air around her seemed to crackle with electricity. The figure's form flickered again, and in an instant, it was right there, standing inches away from her. Lucia gasped, but before she could move, she felt something cold press against her chest, like icy fingers digging into her very soul. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled backward, falling against the wall. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls warping and shifting as the figure loomed over her. "You cannot break the chain," the figure whispered, its breath icy against her ear. "The house will never let you go. The curse will never die." Lucia's body was shaking, her thoughts racing. The walls were closing in. The shadows were alive, and the house was pulling her deeper into its web. She was trapped, bound by the same bloodline that had cursed her family for generations. There was no escaping the truth. But in the depths of the terror, Lucia found something, a flicker of defiance, a spark that refused to be snuffed out by the house's endless grip. She slammed her hands into the floor, pushing herself up with every ounce of strength she had left. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking through the suffocating silence. The figure flinched, its form wavering as though it had been struck. Lucia didn't give up. She pushed harder, forcing herself to stand, her feet unsteady beneath her. "You don't own me." Her voice rang out, louder this time, filled with a power she didn't know she had. The shadows seemed to retreat for a moment, and the figure staggered back. But Lucia knew it wasn't over. The house was still here, still watching, still waiting. She could feel it. But for the first time, Lucia felt a surge of power that came from within. The house had taken so much from her, but it hadn't taken her will. And that, her will to survive, was the key. Episode 8, The Awakening. The night was no longer silent. Lucia stood at the window of the master bedroom, staring out at the moonlit landscape. The manor stretched out before her, its silhouette a dark and twisted reflection in the fading light of dusk. The wind howled through the trees, and the first whispers of the storm reached her ears. But it wasn't the weather that made her shiver. It was the house. Silverbrook Manor had always been a place of darkness, but tonight it was different. The air was charged with an unsettling energy, a feeling that something was stirring deep within the walls, something that had been waiting for years. Lucia had tried to convince herself that she was imagining it, but the truth was undeniable. The house was alive, and it was waking up. Her thoughts spiraled back to the events of the past few days. After the confrontation with the shadowy figure, the malevolent force that had haunted her for so long, She had thought she was free. She had thought the curse was broken. But the house had changed. It was no longer just a place of memories and ghosts. It had become something more. She could feel it now, crawling under her skin. The whispers had stopped for a while, but now they were back. Faint at first, then growing louder with each passing hour. The walls groaned. The floors creaked. The house was alive, and it had tasted blood. It wanted more. She turned away from the window, feeling a cold draft brush against her face. Her hand instinctively reached out for the box, the cursed box that had started all of this. She hadn't dared open again since that night, but now she couldn't resist. Something inside her urged her to open it, to see what had been left behind. The box sat on the table beside her, its intricate carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. She could hear it calling to her, feel its pull in the deepest recesses of her mind. It had always been there, in the back of her consciousness, but now it was impossible to ignore. It had become a part of her. Lucia hesitated, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the box. The air around her thickened, pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, more aggressive. The house was feeding off her fear, and she could feel it. It wanted her to open the box. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, there was no letter, no parchment. Instead, there was a mirror, a small, ornate mirror with an intricate frame, its surface blackened with age. The edges were adorned with symbols she recognized, though their meaning escaped her. The moment she touched the mirror, a shock of cold surged through her. It felt as though the very air around her had been sucked into the mirror, as if it were a portal into something else. Lucia's reflection stared back at her, but the longer she looked, the more distorted it became. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes burning with malevolent fire. She recoiled, stepping back, but the reflection did not move with her. It was as though the mirror held something else. "Lucia," the whisper came from behind her, soft at first, but it quickly grew louder. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her blood ran cold as the voice wrapped around her mind, suffocating her with its power. "Lucia," it repeated, its tone growing more insistent. "Come to us. We are waiting. The house calls you." Lucia spun around, but there was no one there. She was alone. Or was she? The room around her seemed to shift, the walls bending in strange angles. The furniture warped, the shadows growing dark and twisted. It was as though the house itself was folding in on her, closing in on her from all sides. The mirror, the reflection, it was no longer just a mirror. It had become a window into something dark, something ancient. Lucia's pulse quickened as she took another step back, her hands trembling. The whispers filled the room, drowning out all other sound. "You belong here," they cooed. "You could not escape the house." Without warning, the air grew colder and the room seemed to fade. Lucia could feel herself being drawn into the mirror. Her feet lifted off the ground, and she stumbled forward, the darkness pulling at her. "No!" she screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house. The shadows closed in around her, pulling her into the mirror as if it were some kind of abyss, a gateway to a place she didn't belong. And then there was nothing. Lucia awoke with a start, her eyes flying open as she gasped for breath. She was no longer in her mother's room. She was standing in the hallway, facing the mirror at the end of the hall. The mirror, the same one she had seen in her mother's room. But now it was different. It was alive. Her reflection stood still, staring at her with the same malicious grin she had seen moments before. The house was watching her, and she could feel its power surging, filling every corner of her mind. The whispers were louder now, clearer, more urgent. "Come to us, Lucia. The time is near. You cannot escape." The shadows around her deepened, and the walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. The house was feeding. It was growing stronger, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Lucia backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The house had always been haunted. It had always been oppressive. But now it was alive. "No," she whispered to herself. "I won't let it take me. I won't let control me." She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The house seemed to fight her at every turn, its walls closing in as if trying to trap her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to get out. She had to break free. The house had given her no choice. But the house wouldn't let her go. As she ran toward the front door, the floor buckled beneath her feet, the walls folding in on themselves, and the very foundation of the house began to crack. The house was alive, and it was angry. The more she tried to escape, the more it fought back. Lucia reached for the door, but as her hand touched the handle, the room around her spun violently. She stumbled back, her body crashing into the ground as the world shifted around her. The whispers were deafening now, consuming her, filling her mind with images of her family, her ancestors, trapped, consumed by the house, just as she was now. "You could not leave, Lucia." The voice was everywhere now, a low growl that seemed to come from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. The house was speaking to her. It knew her, and it knew that there was no way out. Lucia's heart hammered in her chest. She felt the house's power growing stronger, its grip tightening around her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. But then, in the midst of the suffocating darkness, she remembered something her mother had said. The bloodline, the curse, the price. Her mother had never truly broken the curse. She had only sealed it in place. And now it was up to Lucia to finish what had been started. But to do that, she had to make the ultimate sacrifice. The house was not just a prison. It was a living, breathing entity, and Lucia's blood was the key. It wanted her. It needed her. And now, there was no turning back. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as the shadows pressed in, and she whispered, "I will break the chain." Episode 9, The Binding. The house had always been a place of shadows. But now, it was a place of nightmares. Lucia stood in the center of the grand foyer, her breath shallow and her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding. The walls, once silent witnesses to the horrors that unfolded here, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was as though the house itself was alive. Its every creak, every groan, a heartbeat, a warning. She had tried to escape. She had tried to break free from the curse, to sever the ties that bound her to this place. But the house had other plans. It had kept her trapped here, ensnared in its web, feeding off her fear, feeding off her bloodline. The whispers had grown louder over the past few days, clearer, more insistent. They echoed in her mind, never ceasing, never letting her go. "You cannot leave, Lucia. You belong to us, forever." The voice wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was in the walls, in the very air she breathed. The house was speaking to her, calling her, and it wasn't done with her yet. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the box, the same box that had started all of this. She had tried to put away, tried to forget about it. But now, it felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to the truth. The box had once been a key, a tool to open the curse, but now it was a prison. Lucia had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a cost. The curse wasn't just a family secret. It was a living force, a force that had shaped every generation of the Reyes family, and now it had claimed her. She was its final prisoner, its last vessel. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Lucia's breath misted in front of her. She couldn't deny it anymore. The house was alive. The shadows were shifting again, stretching toward her like hungry hands. And there, in the corner of the room, she saw it, the mirror. It was always there, watching her, an unblinking eye in the darkness. The same mirror she had seen in the attic, in her mother's room, the one that had shown her the faces of the past, the figures of those long gone. But now, the reflection was different. The glass rippled, distorting, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Lucia's heart skipped a beat as the reflection of her own face twisted and contorted. It was her, but it wasn't. Her eyes were hollow, black as night, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. The reflection in the mirror was a mockery, a grotesque parody of her true self. "Lucia, you are one of us now." The voice came from the mirror, her voice twisted, cold, malevolent. Lucia stumbled back, the air in her lungs turning to ice. She couldn't look away. The mirror held her captive, pulling her into its depths, showing her a version of herself that she couldn't comprehend, a version that had been forged by the house's curse. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing in on her. The house was closing in. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had claimed her. With a sudden, frantic burst of energy, Lucia turned away from the mirror and ran for the stairs. She had to get out of there. The house was too much. Its influence was overwhelming, its power unyielding. But as she reached the bottom of the staircase, she stopped. The door, the front door, the way out. She had always thought that the house's grip would loosen once she broke the curse, once she confronted the darkness. But now she knew the truth. There was no breaking free. There was no escape. Lucia approached the door, her hand reaching for the handle. The house seemed to sigh, the walls groaning as if it were shifting beneath her feet. She could feel it now more than ever, the pull, the suffocating, unrelenting pull of the house. It was trying to keep her. She grasped the handle, her hands slick with sweat. But as she tried to turn it, the door wouldn't budge. It was as though something invisible, something powerful, was holding it shut. "Leave, Lucia," the voice whispered. "You cannot escape. You belong to this place. Forever." The air around her seemed to pulse, as though the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, creeping closer, as though they were alive, as though they had a mind of their own. And then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was the man from the attic, the one who had haunted her dreams, the one who had tried to claim her as part of the house. But now he was different. He was no longer just a shadow. He was solid, real, and his eyes burned with an unnatural light, an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Lucia," he said, his voice cold, like the sound of breaking ice. "You cannot escape what has already been set in motion." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. His face was pale, his features gaunt, and his eyes were hollow, burning with a fire that seemed to burn from within. The very air around him seemed to warp, twisting and bending with every step he took. Lucia backed away, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The house was closing in, suffocating her, and there was nowhere to run. "You are mine now, Lucia," the figure said, his voice a low, resonant growl. "You are bound to this house. You always have been, and now you will be a part of it, just as your ancestors were." The figure reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. Lucia gasped, feeling his cold fingers dig into her skin, as though they were pulling her closer to him, pulling her into the darkness. She could feel the house's presence pressing in on her from all sides. It was alive, it was here, and there was nothing she could do to escape it. Suddenly, she heard something, a faint whisper, just a breath, but was enough to break through the overwhelming silence. "You can still fight, Lucia. You can still break the chain." It was her mother's voice. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. "Mom," she whispered, her heart pounding. "You must destroy the heart of the house," her mother's voice continued, faint but clear. "The house feeds on your bloodline. It always has. But you can end it. You can free us all." Lucia's mind raced, her thoughts spinning with confusion and fear. The house, the figure, the curse. Everything was coming at her at once, threatening to consume her. Her mother's voice was still there, faint but insistent. She had heard it before, but now it felt different. It was guiding her, showing her a way out. But how? How could she possibly escape the house's grip when it had already taken everything from her? The figure, still standing before her, seemed to sense her hesitation. His grip tightened on her wrist, his fingers like ice. "You are mine," he growled again, his voice low and menacing. "The house will claim you, just as it claimed your ancestors. You cannot escape. The bloodline is bound." Lucia fought against his grip, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything. With a final, desperate push, Lucia wrenched herself free from the figure's grasp. The house screamed in response, its walls shaking violently, as though the very foundation of the manor was protesting. The darkness seemed to explode around her, the shadows writhing and clawing at her as she stumbled backward, her mind spinning, her body shaking with terror. And then it happened. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Episode 10, The Final Binding. The darkness was closing in. Lucia could feel it. The house was breathing. She could hear the soft groans of the walls, the creaking of the floors beneath her feet, and the whispering voices that grew louder with every passing moment. It was as if the very air in Silverbrook Manor was charged with an ancient, malevolent force, one that was desperate for her to submit, desperate for her to surrender to it. She had tried to fight. She had tried to break free from the curse, to break the chain that had bound her family for generations. But now, standing at the heart of the house, she realized with chilling certainty that there was no escaping it. The house had always been a living, breathing entity, but it was more than that now. It was hungry, it was powerful, and it had claimed her. Lucia's body trembled as she stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her gaze fixed on the darkened hallway ahead. The echoes of her mother's voice still rang in her ears, urging her to destroy the heart of the house, to break the curse once and for all. But the house was a labyrinth, a twisted maze of corridors and secrets, each step she took only leading her deeper into its grasp. "You cannot run," the voice whispered from the shadows. "You are ours. You always have been." Lucia's heart raced as she turned toward the source of the voice. There, in the center of the room, stood the mirror, the same one that had haunted her since the beginning, the mirror that had shown her her darkest fears, her twisted reflections. It shimmered in the dim light, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The air around her seemed to thrum with an energy that made her skin crawl. The house was alive, feeding off her fear, her pain, her regret. It was as though the very walls were pushing in on her, trapping her in its grip, making her feel small, insignificant, and powerless. Lucia swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "I can do this," she whispered to herself. "I will do this." She had to. There was no other choice. If she didn't destroy the heart of the house, the curse would never end. It would consume her, just as it had consumed her ancestors, just as it had consumed everyone who had ever lived within these walls. She stepped forward, her feet heavy on the floorboards. Each step felt like a weight, each movement slow and deliberate, as though the house itself were trying to hold her back, to keep her from reaching the truth. The mirror loomed before her, its surface reflecting the shadows, the darkness, and the fear that twisted within her. Lucia reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold glass. The moment her skin made contact, the world around her seemed to shift, the room distorted, twisting and bending like a nightmare, and she was pulled forward, her body lurching as if the mirror itself had a grip on her soul. For a moment, Lucia could see nothing but blackness. It felt as though she were falling, spiraling into the abyss, and then, suddenly, there was a light, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. It was a cold, ethereal glow, and surrounded her like a halo, casting long shadows across the walls. And then she saw them, the figures, the ones she had seen in the mirror before, her ancestors, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes empty, their bodies bound by chains that seemed to stretch out into the darkness. They were prisoners of the house, trapped for eternity. "Lucia," one of them whispered, its voice low and raspy, like a dying breath. "You cannot save us. We are bound to this place. You will be too." The figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, and Lucia felt her body freeze in place. The shadows seemed to pull at her, their grasp tightening around her like a vice. She could feel the house's presence, its hunger, its need to claim her. But in that moment, she realized something. She was not alone. Her mother's voice, her true voice, spoke to her once more. "You are stronger than this, Lucia. You are the key. You have always been the key." Lucia's heart raced as the realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't here to save her ancestors. She wasn't here to break the curse for them. She was here to break it for herself. She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached the chains that bound the figures in the dark. The shadows tried to pull her back, but she refused to give in. She had broken the curse once before, and she could do it again. With a cry of defiance, Lucia reached into the darkness and tore at the chains, feeling them snap beneath her fingers. The figures screamed as they were freed, their forms dissolving into the ether, their voices merging into one final, desperate wail. As the last of the figures disappeared, the house groaned, the walls shuddered, the foundation of Silverbrook Manor trembled beneath her feet, and the darkness began to recede. Lucia stumbled backward, her breath ragged as the house seemed to collapse around her. The mirror shattered, its pieces falling to the floor like shards of glass, scattering across the room. The oppressive energy that had once filled the house began to dissipate, leaving behind an eerie stillness. But as the darkness lifted, Lucia saw it. The heart of the house, a shadow darker than the night itself, standing at the far end of the room. Its eyes gleamed with fiery intensity, burning with the same malevolent energy that had consumed the house for centuries. It was the true source of the curse, the force that had bound her family to Silverbrook Manor for so long. "You cannot escape me, Lucia," the shadow growled, its voice a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the room. "You are mine. Your blood is mine." Lucia's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, fear gripped her. But she had come too far. She had made too many sacrifices to turn back now. "No," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I am not yours. I am not part of this anymore." With a final cry of defiance, Lucia reached for the broken pieces of the mirror, its shards gleaming like silver knives in the dim light. She knew what she had to do. The house had lived on the bloodline, on the sacrifice of her ancestors. But she was different. She was the one who would end it, with all the strength she could muster. Lucia hurled the shard of the mirror into the heart of the shadow. The moment it made contact, the room seemed to explode in a burst of light, the sound of shattering glass filling her ears as the darkness screamed in agony. The house trembled, the foundation cracking, the walls buckling under the weight of its own destruction. Lucia's body was thrown back as a wave of energy slammed into her, and for a moment, everything went black. When she woke, the house was silent. Silverbrook Manor stood before her, but it was different. The oppressive energy was gone. The walls were no longer alive with malice. The shadows had receded, leaving only the faintest echoes of what had once been. Lucia sat up, her body aching, and looked around. The curse was broken. The house was free. But as she stood and turned to leave, she realized that part of her would always be tied to Silverbrook Manor. The echoes of her ancestors, the whispers of the past, would always be with her. But she had done it. She had freed herself. Episode 11, Aftermath of the Curse. The silence was suffocating. Lucia stood at the threshold of Silverbrook Manor, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked out at the estate. The house, once alive with the whispers of the past, now stood still, dead almost. The oppressive presence that had lingered in every corner of the mansion had lifted, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural calm. The curse had been broken, the bloodlines severed, and for the first time in years, Lucia felt as though she could breathe freely. Or so she thought. Silverbrook Manor, now bathed in the pale light of dawn, looked almost peaceful. The once menacing shadows were gone. The walls no longer seemed to pulse with dark energy. The whispers that had filled the house, the voices that had tormented her for so long, had fallen silent. But as Lucia stepped further into the mansion, she felt a strange heaviness settle in the pit of her stomach. The house, though no longer alive with malice, was not truly at peace. The silence was not the peace she had imagined it would be. Instead, it was a haunting stillness, a vacuum, as though something had been torn away, something that could never be restored. The living room, once filled with the oppressive energy of the curse, was now a hollow shell. The air was still, thick with dust and memories, but there was no sign of the presence that had once gripped it so tightly. Lucia stood in the middle of the room, her eyes tracing the faded wallpaper, the cracked floorboards, and the portraits on the walls. Portraits of her ancestors, those whose lives had been bound to this house, to this curse. The house was still haunted. It had always been haunted by the souls of those who had lived and died within its walls. But now, The haunting was different. It wasn't the same as before. There were no voices, no shadows creeping across the floor. There was only a deep, unsettling void. Lucia's fingers brushed against the wooden banister as she made her way toward the stairs. Her mind raced, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her. She had broken the curse. She had freed herself and her ancestors, but in doing so, had she released something worse? Was there something darker beneath the surface of the house? Something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The hallway stretched out before her, leading to the attic, the room she had never dared enter as a child, the room that had always been off-limits, a place where her mother had kept secrets, where the house had seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Lucia's footsteps echoed in the silence as she approached the attic door, her hand reaching for the cold brass handle. The moment her fingers touched it, she felt it, the pulse. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, a vibration in the air, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, beating through the walls, through the floorboards, through her very skin. The house was alive again, with a trembling hand. Lucia turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic, once a dark, forgotten space, was now filled with soft, natural light filtering in through a small, dust-covered window. The air was thick with the scent of old books and mildew. But something else lingered in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustling of paper in the wind. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing had changed. The same forgotten furniture sat in the corners, the same boxes stacked against the walls. But there was something different now. Something more. Lucia moved toward the far corner, where the old chest had once been. She had opened it before, in her search for answers, but now she felt an odd compulsion to look inside again. Her heart quickened as she lifted the lid, revealing the contents. An assortment of old books, fragile and worn, their pages yellowed with age. But something caught her eye, a small worn envelope tucked inside one of the books. Her name was written on it, in the same handwriting as the letter she had found in the box. Her mother's handwriting. For Lucia, the final truth. Lucia's breath caught in her throat as she pulled the letter from the envelope. The words were familiar, yet they filled her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. Lucia, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means you have done it. You have broken the curse. You have freed the souls of our family. But know this, the curse was never truly broken. It was merely transferred. The house was never just a home. It was a vessel for the souls that were bound to it. The bloodline is no longer yours to control. It is the house's. Lucia's hands trembled as she read on. The power of Silverbrook Manor is not gone. It has shifted. It has passed from you to the house itself. You are the final binding, Lucia. The last key. You must destroy the house if you wish to free yourself. But be warned, if you do, you will have to sacrifice everything. Your family, your memories, your soul. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the letter pressing down on her chest. Her mother had known. She had known that there was no escape. She had known that breaking the curse would not bring freedom, but instead would transfer the house's malevolent power to Lucia herself. The final binding. Lucia's bloodline was the house's anchor. She had freed the spirits, yes, but in doing so, she had bound herself to the house. The curse had not been broken. It had been shifted. And now, the house was waiting for her to destroy it. But to do so, she would have to sacrifice everything. Lucia's mind raced. She couldn't breathe. She had thought she had won. She had thought she had freed herself, her family, the souls that had been trapped in Silverbrook Manor. But the house had lied. It had deceived her. She had to make a choice. What would she sacrifice to break free? The house groaned, the walls shaking, the floor creaking beneath her. The whispers grew louder, their voices now a cacophony of fear and anger. You could not run from the house. You belong to it now. Destroy it, Lucia. Destroy everything. End it. Her thoughts blurred as the air around her thickened. The presence of the house growing stronger, more insistent. She could feel it. A presence like a storm, gathering, building, feeding off her fear, offer uncertainty. Lucia glanced down at the chest, at the letter in her hands. She could hear her mother's voice in her head again, guiding her. You are the key, but you are also the answer. The attic grew darker, the shadows stretching across the room as though they were alive, reaching for her, pulling her into the depths of the house. Lucia knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, she turned to face the mirror again, the mirror that had haunted her throughout this entire journey, the reflection that had twisted, that had shown her the darkest parts of herself, the mirror that had been the first piece of the puzzle. She walked toward it, her legs heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. The house was watching. The house was waiting, and she was its final prisoner. Episode 12, The Heart of the House. The air was thick with dread. Lucia stood at the threshold of the grand staircase, her body still, yet trembling with the knowledge of what she had to do. The house stretched out before her. Its towering walls, dark corridors, and twisted shadows all seemed to pulsate with life of their own. It was no longer a place that merely haunted her. It had become a part of her. The curse had shifted, and now, its weight pressed down on her with an intensity she could not escape. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind, a constant, unrelenting reminder of what was at stake. The house is not just a place, Lucia. It is a living force, and it feeds off the bloodline. You are the final key. Her blood, her family, the echoes of those who had come before her. She had broken the curse. But in doing so, she had bound herself to Silverbrook Manor. There was no easy way out. The house had twisted her fate, and now, there was only one choice left. The silence was suffocating, but Lucia could still feel the pulse beneath the floorboards. It was faint, like the heartbeat of the house itself, but it was there, alive. She took a step forward, then another, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The house seemed to be watching her, waiting for her to make a move, to give in to its will. The whispers, which had been silent for days, returned. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They were in the walls, the floor, the air, the voices of her ancestors, trapped, bound to this place. Lucia, you can't escape. You will never be free. She pushed the whispers out of her mind, trying to steady her breath. No, she thought, I won't give in. I won't let it take me. Silverbrook Manor had been a prison for her family for generations. And now, Lucia realized it was up to her to end it once and for all. But there was no escaping the truth. The house had always been a part of her. Her bloodline, her ancestors, all of it had been shaped by this cursed place. And now, in breaking the cycle, she had become its final anchor. Lucia moved deeper into the heart of the house. The rooms, once familiar, now felt alien to her. They were suffocating. The air thick with the weight of centuries of memories. Memories of those who had lived and died within these walls. She could feel them now, their presence pressing down on her. In the distance, she saw the familiar shape of the old mirror, the mirror that had first revealed the truth to her, the mirror that had shown her the dark reflection of herself, the one that had been a window into her ancestors' torment. Her heart hammered in her chest as she walked toward it. Her fingers brushed the cold surface of the mirror, and instantly, the room seemed to distort. The shadows twisted, as though the very air was alive, warping around her. The reflection in the mirror rippled, and for a moment, Lucia saw herself, not as she was, but as she had been before, in the clutches of the house's power. She stepped back, her pulse racing. The mirror seemed to pulse with an eerie glow, its surface flickering like a dying flame. The reflection of her face in the glass twisted, shifting into something else, something ancient and terrifying. Her eyes blackened, her skin pale, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. It wasn't her. It was the house. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The walls began to hum with a low, resonant sound, as though the house itself was alive and hungry. Lucia, you cannot break the chain. You are ours. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, a jagged line splitting down the center. The glass shattered, falling to the floor in a cascade of sparkling fragments. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the shadows recoiling as if in pain. Lucia gasped, her heart racing as she stumbled back. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, the house groaned. It was a sound unlike anything Lucia had ever heard before, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very foundation of Silverbrook Manor. The walls trembled. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The house was waking up. Lucia turned and ran. She could feel the house's grip tightening around her, pulling her into the depths of its malevolent power. The corridor stretched out before her, dark and endless, like a labyrinth designed to trap her. She could hear the whispers again, louder now. You can't escape. The house owns you. It always will. She reached the stairs, her legs trembling beneath her as she ascended, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house seemed to fight her every step, its walls closing in, its presence growing stronger. The heartbeat she felt earlier was louder now, a pounding rhythm that echoed to the halls like a drum. Lucia reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the final room, the attic where it had all begun, the room that had held the truth, the room that had revealed the curse. But now, as she stood before the door, she realized the truth. The house wasn't just a place. It was a part of her, and the only way to end the cycle was to destroy the heart of the house. The attic door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was as it had always been, filled with dust and forgotten relics. But there, in the center of the room, was a small wooden chest. The chest her mother had hidden, the chest that had been the key to everything. Lucia hesitated for a moment before approaching it. She could feel the house's power pressing down on her, its weight suffocating, as though it were trying to stop her from opening it. But she had come this far. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside was a book, old, weathered, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was decorated with strange symbols, their meaning lost to time. It was a book of the house, the final piece of the puzzle. Lucia opened the book, her eyes scanning the ancient text. It was written in a language she didn't recognize, but she could feel its power. The words seemed to whisper to her, as though the very pages were alive. To break the chain, the heart of the house must be destroyed, she read aloud, her voice trembling. The words burned into her mind. The bloodline must be severed, and the house must be consumed by fire. Only then will the curse be broken. The house trembled again, the walls groaning as though they were alive, and Lucia felt the energy around her crackle. The house was fighting back, trying to prevent her from completing the ritual. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't enough to break the curse. She had to destroy the house itself. The heart of the house, the very source of its power, had to be consumed by fire. The bloodline, her bloodline, had to be severed once and for all. But there was a catch. The sacrifice she would have to make was not just her life. She would have to sacrifice her memories, her identity. The price of breaking the curse was not just her life. It was everything that made her who she was. Lucia felt the house close in around her, the walls pushing against her, as if it were trying to crush her under its weight. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final confrontation. She had come this far. She had broken the curse. But now, the true test was before her, to destroy the house. To free herself, she would have to let go of everything. Episode 13, The Return of the Shadows. The house was no longer silent. Lucia had thought that after breaking the curse, after severing the ties between herself and the house, that the oppressive presence would dissipate. But instead, there was something different in the air now. A heaviness, a strange pulse that hadn't been there before. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, as if reaching for her, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, each sound amplified in the unnatural stillness. Silverbrook Manor had always been a house of darkness, but now it felt like the darkness itself had taken root, festered, and was growing. Lucia's breath was shallow as she moved through the foyer, her footsteps slow, hesitant. She had hoped, prayed, that breaking the curse would free her, but the house felt more alive than ever, and the spirits that had once been trapped by the curse were not gone. They were here, watching, waiting. The whispers, once faint, now filled the space around her, pressing into her ears, echoing in the depths of her mind. They were more than just distant voices now. They were real, alive. Lucia, the voice was familiar, soft, sorrowful. It was her mother's voice. But there was something off about it, something distorted, twisted. "Lucia, you must return." Her heart stuttered in her chest. Her mother. Was it truly her voice? Lucia had thought the house had taken everything from her. Her family, her memories, her freedom. But now, the house was calling her back. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, moving like living things, as though they were no longer just remnants of the past, but something with a will of their own. Lucia's pulse quickened as she turned toward the stairs. The house was changing. It was no longer just a haunted place, but something alive, something ancient that had fed on the darkness for far too long. She reached the staircase, her fingers gripping the banister as she ascended. The house seemed to breathe around her, the air thick with an unnatural pressure. She could feel it now. The presence of something dark, something that had been awakened. The whispers became more insistent, more demanding. They surrounded her, suffocating her, as though they were trying to drag her back into the depths of the house. The shadows seemed to coil around her, pulling her into their grasp. Lucia forced herself to move forward, despite the weight of the house pressing down on her. As she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The door to her mother's room loomed in front of her, its frame like an unholy gateway to the past. She could feel the house's eyes on her, watching her every movement, as though it were waiting for her to make the wrong choice. The echoes of her mother's voice still lingered in her mind, urging her forward. "It's not over, Lucia." Lucia opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been before, dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn tight, the air stale and oppressive. But now it felt different. It felt colder. The house had shifted. The atmosphere was heavier, thicker. There was a presence in the room, something that hadn't been there before. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Her eyes were drawn to the old rocking chair in the corner of the room. It had always been there, a relic of her childhood, but now it seemed to move on its own, rocking gently back and forth. Lucia swallowed hard as she approached the chair, her heart pounding in her chest. Something wasn't right. The house had never been this active, this aware. The curse might have been broken, but the house wasn't finished with her. As she reached the chair, she saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room. It was fleeting at first, a movement from the corner of her eye. But then it materialized, a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in the darkness. The air around Lucia seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room closing in. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps soundless, as though it were made of the same darkness that filled the house. "Lucia?" The figure's voice was soft, but it sent a chill down her spine. "It's not over. You've freed the house, but you've also bound yourself to it. You cannot leave. You will never leave." Lucia's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a spirit of her ancestors. This was something else. Something darker. The shadows that had once been passive now seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, as if they were feeding off the fear that radiated from her. She backed away. But the figure stepped closer, its presence growing more oppressive with every movement. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in, the air thick with something ancient and dangerous. "You thought you were free, Lucia, but you were never meant to escape." The figure's face emerged from the darkness, but it was not human. Its features were distorted, twisted, like something torn from the very fabric of reality. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, and its mouth opened in a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Lucia stumbled back, her heart racing. The house wasn't just a prison for her ancestors. It was a prison for something else, something ancient, and it had been awakened by her actions. The curse had not been broken. It had merely been shifted. The figure advanced toward her, its movements unnatural, fluid, like a shadow stretching across the room. Lucia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The house had always been a place of terror, but this was something different. The house was no longer just a place that trapped souls. It was alive, and it wanted her. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward her, its fingers elongated, unnaturally long. Lucia could feel the darkness closing in, the house feeding off her fear, pulling her into its depths. She knew she had to do something, but her mind was clouded with panic. What had she done? What had she unleashed? The figure spoke again, its voice low and guttural. like the sound of stones grinding together. "You are mine, Lucia. Your bloodline is bound to this house, and you will be ours." A wave of darkness washed over her, and for a moment, Lucia felt her strength wane. The house was consuming her, wrapping its shadows around her, pulling her into its grasp. She could feel herself slipping, losing control. But then, something within her stirred. Her mother's voice. The final warning. "You are the key, Lucia. You have always been the key." Lucia's eyes shot open, and with a final burst of strength, she pushed forward, breaking free from the figure's grasp. She felt the house's power recoil, as if it were not used to resistance, as though her defiance had shocked it. She stumbled toward the door, her legs shaking beneath her, her breath ragged, but she didn't stop. The figure screamed behind her, the sound of its voice splitting the air, but Lucia didn't look back. The house was alive, but so was she, and she would fight for her freedom. Episode 14, The Awakening of the True Curse. The walls of Silverbrook Manor seemed to groan under the weight of 1,000 souls. Lucia stood at the threshold of the study, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the old oak door. The house was silent now. At least it seemed silent on the surface, but there was a growing sense of unease in the air. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but now they were constant, low murmurs that seemed to seep into every crack, every corner of the house. She had thought she had broken the curse. She had thought that she had freed herself and her ancestors from the house's grip. But the truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Silverbrook Manor wasn't just a haunted house. It wasn't just a prison. It was something older, something far more powerful. And Lucia was no longer just its prisoner. She was a part of it. The door to the study creaked open, and the darkness inside seemed to reach out toward her like a living thing. Lucia hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on her. The very air felt thick with secrets, with hidden truths she had yet to uncover. She stepped inside, her feet echoing on the wooden floor. The study was the same as it had always been, dimly lit, lined with shelves of old books, the heavy curtains drawn shut. But there was something different now, something that wasn't there before. The air was colder. Lucia moved further into the room, her eyes drawn to the desk in the corner, the papers that were still untouched, as though they had been waiting for her to come back. But it wasn't the papers that caught her attention. It was the mirror that hung above the desk. It was the same mirror from her mother's room, the same mirror that had shown her twisted reflections of herself, the same mirror that had revealed the dark truth of her bloodline. But now, the mirror was different. Lucia's breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The surface of the mirror seemed to ripple, as though it were alive. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't just a reflection. The figure that stood behind her in the glass was not her. It was the figure from her nightmares, the shadow that had haunted her since the moment she stepped into the house. The figure was tall, thin, its face obscured by darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Lucia," the voice was cold, like ice. It came from a mirror, but it seemed to reverberate through the room, filling every corner with an oppressive presence. "You cannot escape. You belong to us now." Lucia's pulse quickened, her legs trembling as she stepped back from the mirror. She could feel the house's grip tightening around her, pulling her into its depths. The figure in the mirror moved, its shadow stretching toward her, its presence more real than ever before. She tried to turn away, but the room seemed to spin, the walls bending and warping around her. The house was shifting again, the very fabric of reality bending under the force of its power. "You are the key, Lucia," the figure said, its voice low and commanding. "You have always been the key." The shadows in the room seemed to reach out for her, and Lucia could feel herself being drawn back toward the mirror. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to darken with every passing second. "The curse is not broken, Lucia. It has only evolved." A sudden chill ran down Lucia's spine, and she gasped for air. The words hit her like a blow, and she stumbled backward, the truth settling over her like a weight she couldn't escape. She had thought that breaking the curse would set her free. She had thought that by severing her bloodline from the house, she would end the cycle of torment. But the house was never meant to be broken. It was meant to evolve, to adapt, and the curse that bound her family for generations had simply shifted. Lucia was no longer just a victim. She was part of the house. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, its form becoming more solid, more real. Lucia's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the full scope of what was happening. The house had changed because of her. She had broken the chains. But in doing so, she had unknowingly fed the house. You have awakened the true curse, Lucia. You were always meant to be the final key. The house has claimed you. Lucia's mind raced. She had thought that the curse was something external, something that could be undone. But now, she realized that the curse wasn't just a force that had trapped her family. It was a part of her bloodline. The house had consumed her, and in doing so, it had become stronger, more alive. She turned to flee, but the room seemed to close in on her, the walls constricting, the shadows moving like living things. She could feel the house's power seeping into her, taking hold of her very soul. The whispers were deafening now, the voices of her ancestors, trapped in a house, calling out to her. You cannot run from what is inside of you. Lucia collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her head as the voices filled her mind, each one louder than the last. She could feel herself losing control, losing herself to the house, to the curse that had defined her family for centuries. Suddenly, the door to the study slammed shut, and Lucia looked up to see the figure standing in the doorway. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real, solid, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. The house has chosen you, Lucia. You will fulfill the final purpose. You will become one with the house. Lucia's vision blurred as the figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its power suffocating. She had to escape. She had to stop it. But how? The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in. The house was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and she was its prisoner. You are the key, the figure repeated, its voice reverberating through her mind. The house has always been waiting for you. Lucia's mind was racing, but there was no escaping the truth. The curse hadn't been broken. It had merely been passed on to her. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the one who would either destroy the house or become one with it. But what choice did she have? Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again, faint but clear. You are the key. You have always been the key. Lucia's eyes snapped open. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, Lucia reached for the book on the desk. The book that had been the source of the house's power. The pages were yellowed brittle, but the words were still there, written in an ancient script. She began to read aloud, the words unfamiliar but powerful. As she spoke, the house trembled, the air thickening, as though it were responding to the incantation. Episode 15, The Final Sacrifice. The air in Silverbrook Manor was thick with dread, suffocating in its silence. Lucia stood in the heart of the house, the walls seeming to close in on her as the weight of her actions pressed down on her chest. The mirror, its fractured glass now scattered across the floor, lay shattered in the corner of the room. The house had begun to tremble, its very foundation shaking with the energy of something ancient, something dark. The spirits that had once been trapped by the curse, the ones she had thought were free, had returned not as echoes of the past, but as vengeful shadows, demanding something from her. The house had awakened, and it was hungry. It wanted her. It had always wanted her. Lucia, her mother's voice echoed to the walls, soft, like a whisper in her ear, but laced with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. It's not over. You have to finish what you started. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She had thought the curse was broken, that she had freed herself from the shackles of her family's past. But now, standing in the middle of the decaying mansion, she realized that she had only opened the door to something far worse. The curse had not been destroyed. It had only evolved. And now, the house was coming for her. Lucia's breath was shallow, her mind a swirl of confusion and fear. She had come to the house to destroy it, to end the cycle of torment that had bound her family for generations. But what had she done? The house was no longer a place. It was an entity, a living, breathing force that thrived on fear, on blood, on memories. Her bloodline had always been tied to this house. And now, The house had claimed her as its final piece. The weight of her mother's words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the ultimate cost. You are the key, Lucia. You're the only one who could destroy the house. But at what cost? She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it building within her since she first stepped foot in the manor. But she had never truly understood the full weight of her decision. She had hoped that by breaking the curse, she would be free. Free of the house. Free of her past. Free of the darkness that had defined her family for so long. But there was no freedom. Not anymore. Lucia's eyes flickered toward the remnants of the shattered mirror. The glass reflected fragments of her face, twisted and distorted, just as it had shown her before, the broken, fractured version of herself that had been trapped in this house, the reflection that had taunted her, shown her the path to her own destruction. But now, the mirror held no answers, only more questions. Lucia? The voice was different now, not her mother's. It was the voice of the house itself, ancient and unyielding, its words seeping into her consciousness, pulling her deeper into its grasp. You are ours now. Your blood, your soul, they belong to this place. Forever. Lucia felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine, and her fingers trembled as they clenched into fists. She had broken the chains. She had thought she had broken free. But now she knew. The house had never truly been bound. It had always been waiting for her to break it open, to release the final key, waiting for her to become part of it. You will never leave, Lucia. You belong to us. The walls of the manor groaned as though they were alive, and the floor beneath Lucia's feet seemed to ripple, like the surface of a dark ocean. The house was awakening to its full power. It wanted more than just her body. It wanted her soul. It wanted to claim her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She staggered backward, her mind spinning. There had to be a way out, a way to undo what had been done. But as she reached the center of the room, the house responded with a low, rumbling growl, its pulse beating in time with her own heartbeat. The ground trembled beneath her, and the air became thick, suffocating. It's too late, the voice whispered, a cold, malevolent presence that seemed to surround her. You are ours. And now, the final ritual must be performed. Lucia's hands went to her chest, her breath ragged, her heart racing as she felt the weight of the curse closing in around her. The house had claimed her. There was no running. There was no escape. What do you want from me? She cried out, her voice breaking. Your soul, came the chilling reply. Your sacrifice. You are the final binding. The house has fed on your bloodline for generations. And now, it is time for you to give yourself to it. Lucia's mind raced as the house's power surged, swirling around her, consuming her thoughts, her memories. The house wasn't just feeding on her fear, it was feeding on her life. The more she resisted, the stronger it became. I won't give in, she whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The whispers of the house were deafening now, and they were so loud, so all-consuming, that she could barely hear her own thoughts. The spirits, the shadows of her ancestors, surrounded her, their hands reaching out, their voices pleading for her to make the ultimate choice. Lucia collapsed to her knees, her hands gripping the floor as she struggled to maintain control. Her breath came in gasps, her body racked with fear and exhaustion. She had fought so hard to break free from the house's grasp, but now it felt as though the very air was being drained from her lungs. You are the key, the voice continued, and now you will become part of the house. Your soul will feed it. You will never leave. You are part of the curse. But in the chaos of the house's power, Lucia found something, a spark of defiance, a thread of strength that she had buried deep inside herself. She had broken the curse once before. She had faced her fears, her ancestors, and the house itself. And now, she had to face the ultimate test. With trembling hands, Lucia reached into the shadows, grasping the remnants of the shattered mirror. She could feel the power of the house vibrating through her fingertips, but she didn't flinch. She had come this far. She would not let it claim her now. Lucia stood, her body shaking with the weight of her decision. She knew what had to be done. The ritual, the one that had been waiting for her, the one that would finally break the curse for good, was the only way forward. But the cost was unimaginable. You are mine, the voice whispered again, now full of desperation. You cannot break free. You will become part of me. Lucia closed her eyes and lifted the mirror shard above her head, the sharp edges glinting in the dim light. She could feel the weight of her decision settling deep in her chest. The house had already taken everything from her, the memories, her family, her future, but she still had one choice left. With a final cry, Lucia brought the shard down, piercing the center of the house's heart, where the power of the curse had been most concentrated. The house screamed in agony, its walls cracking, its foundation crumbling beneath the weight of the ritual. And then silence. Lucia fell to her knees, gasping for breath as the dust and debris settled around her. The house was still. For the first time in years, Silverbrook Manor was quiet. The whispers had stopped. The shadows had receded. The curse was broken. But at what cost? Lucia's eyes fluttered open. The world around her was blurry, her mind clouded. She had done it. She had destroyed the house. The curse was gone. But her memories, her life, her family, they were all lost. The house had taken everything. But in the end, Lucia was free.